My name is David Wickham. I'm the Vice President of the South Brevard Historical Society. I want to welcome each and every one of you here today. I'm really looking forward to this presentation today. I'm an old contractor from way back when. My father's general contract license was 001 in the Brevard County. And so I get a kick looking at the historical buildings and things along that line. And we are very, very fortunate today to have Michael Bloomstead with us. He is the not just a librarian with the library system, he is also executive, I think, president of the archives here in Brevard County that we actually have. And he's going to be presenting us today talking about the architectural heritage of South Brevard. So without any further ado, let's give him a big hand of applause.
All the way over.
Try it. Okay. Awesome. We'll get it there. Get a second to get set up here. May have to. Usually we have to adjust these a couple times. Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna set this here. Let's see, can you hear there? Yeah. Testing, testing, there we go. That sounds pretty good, right? Okay, awesome. All right, well, I'm glad to see everybody out here on a Saturday afternoon, especially when it's like perfect nap time right now, isn't it? It's like, gosh, this is like just right at that time. So it's a pleasure being down here with you guys again. I always like coming to this group. It's a great group. You guys are always so interested and have got so many things going on here in South Brevard. And I developed this talk today. I was asked to kind of talk about the history of South Brevard architecture history based on a talk I did over at Helen Blaze's brewery last year, I think, in a fundraiser that we did. And some people heard it and asked me if I could kind of expand on that for this group. So I did a whole custom presentation for you guys, all right? This has never been heard before. This is all brand new stuff, so I did it just for you guys. I knew you guys would appreciate it. So what we're going to do is talk about the architectural history of South Brevard, and I'm going to do a little talking, and then I'm going to just sit down here. I'm going to get out of your way so that you can see all of the photos and stuff. And let me get this launched here. And we'll get started from there. Okay. So I want to say a few things about this first. Obviously, going to talk about the architectural history of South Brevard. I had to put some limits on it here. So we're going to start from really the earliest period here in 1869, and some cases a little before, till about 1940 is the time period we're going to try to cover. And instead of me just droning on and on about boring architectural details and brackets or something, what I wanted to do was give you guys really take you through a photographic journey of the architecture itself. And we are really fortunate that we have such great photos to really illustrate what I'm going to talk about. And so we want to give some credit to, before I even start, about 80% of these photos are from the We Own a Cleveland collection. And I know most of you know We Own a longtime member here and a noted historian in Brevard County for many, many years. She collected all of these throughout her career, and she has over the last several years been donating these things that are in her personal collection to our historical commission there at the library in Cocoa. And we have scanned them all, and they've all been indexed and are all available to the public as well. And that's where about 80% of these photos that we're going to be showing today are from her archives. So we just want to acknowledge that. And before I get into it, I'm going to give you a little bit of background here on the architecture itself and tell you what I'm going to talk about. The historic buildings in South Brevard exhibit a wide range of forms and architectural styles. They were, with a few exceptions, designed and constructed by lay builders who drew upon traditional building techniques and contemporary style preferences for their inspiration. The primary consideration was given to providing functional and comfortable living spaces for people working, and decorative features, although of secondary importance, were often applied liberally. Numerous buildings, especially those constructed during the era of economic expansions in the late 19th century and land boom period, display an elaborate level of detail such as woodwork and architectural detailing. The styles that we're going to talk about today are not necessarily just local to this area, obviously. The pattern books and things that were published by architects in the late 1800s really made it possible for people to construct buildings that were the same from Maine to Florida, using the same type of architectural plans and elements that came out of factories in those things, and you'll see a lot of that in here. Another thing that you'll note is probably not a surprise, but stylistically, the highest percentage of buildings that we have in South Brevard exhibit what we call vernacular designs. In other words, they were not high style, fancy buildings. These were buildings that were built to serve a purpose and were done with basic materials. In my survey that I did and looking at some of these buildings, the masonry vernacular, which is storefronts, those type of things, and the frame vernacular styles made up 70% of all of the buildings that we had in South Brevard. So that gives you an idea of what a high percentage were just vernacular styles. But we do have great examples of a Mediterranean revival, classical revival, Queen Anne, and all those things that we're going to talk about today. And what I did for the purpose of this talk was to break it down into 4 basic periods within this. And the first period we're going to talk about is 1869 to 1895. And then we're going to go from there. So if anybody has any questions too while I'm going along, I'm just going to sit here and get out of your way, and we'll flip through some of these. And I have quite a few slides, so some of them I'm going to spend a little more time on, and then some of them I'm just going to kind of blip through just to give you an idea so you can see something, but we don't want to keep you here all day. All right, so early development, 1869 to 1895. All right, so this is what we're looking at to start with here in this area. This is actually one of the oldest photos that I'm going to show you. And this cabin likely predates the period we're going to talk about. There is speculation that this cabin could even be from the 1840s, from the Indian Wars period. And this was actually on the north side of Turkey Creek in the area known as Castaway Point. And you will see that it is a log cabin. Some have been made of palm. This is not. It looks like it's probably pine. Filled in with boards on the side. You've got the cedar shake roof. You've got a coquina, what looks like a coquina fireplace built there that is actually leaning away from the structure there to keep it, keep the risk of fire down there. And it's hard to see with the lighting we have here in the photo, but the man in the doorway is African American, probably is one of the early settlers. We know Melbourne in particular was settled by a lot of African Americans, the former slaves, freed slaves, those type of things that came to the area. So this is likely belongs to that period. You can see this is really neat. You can see the little chicken coop in the front yard that's probably handmade, and his hoe by the door there, and an axe over to the side over here, and the water in the background. So it gives you a really good idea of how we really started here with settlement. And this actually is a little bit fancier than some of them, as you're going to see here on the next one. So it could even be, this is even later than that photo, but was even a simpler photo. This is Gottlieb Krogel. Most of you are probably familiar with him. They settled down on Barker's Bluff, and he was the Krogels were the ones that started the Pelican, the Island National Refuge down there. This is what they refer to as their palmetto shanty. And so he built this about 1879 on top of the huge bluff that was down there, which was the Indian the Indian mound that was made of all the oyster shells that once towered over the Indian River. And this was on top of that, all made of palmettos. There you see like a little board and batten door, and you do see what looks like a little masonry chimney coming out of the top there. So there was some sort of some heating source in there. And I can imagine the palmettos, I think it was probably a pretty good insulating material, all layered on there like that. If you're anything like me, I can't help but think about all the palmetto bugs that probably were sharing the palmetto shanty with me, which I think would have really creeped me out. Can imagine us flying around in the middle of the night in there. That could not have been very glamorous, I don't think. But it served its purpose. And this house, no surprise, if you want to call that, was blown away by a hurricane not long after this picture was taken. And the Krogel family replaced this with a large wooden frame structure on top of the mound in about 1908. So that kind of just shows you the progression, which is sort of what everybody did here. But this is sort of what we started with. This is another picture here from the area of, again, another palmetto shanty with a door, and you see very egalitarian society here. You see another African American over here on the left-hand side with a hoe, and the whole family sitting out there around the fire with the dog and everything. And 1860, Brevard County only had 300 inhabitants and 31 slaves. So that gives you an idea of what a small group of people that we were dealing with at this time period, how sparsely settled it actually was. This is another one. See Johnny Hyatt's back here. This is the Smith family palmetto that they built down at Mullet Creek there at Honest John's, what's still there today. I think this is Robert and Charlie Smith right in front there. So this again is what the early settlers started with, and this was replaced by the frame house that's still there in about 1899.
In the photograph on the left-hand side is a cabbage palm tree that's still there.
Oh, wow.
It's not in the picture.
Isn't that awesome?
Oh, my.
So yes, very industrious here. And then this is a picture, I just threw this in because this is what's believed to be the front porch of the Smith house much later. And there's Laura Smith Hyatt on the porch, and Hollis Bottomly down here in his fancy cravat down there. A bunch of the pictures we have Hollis in them. He was quite the man about town apparently. He's in about every picture we have in some striking array of hats and very dandy outfits all the time. In the middle of nowhere often, like in the middle of a field, you see Hollis posed out there in some kind of fancy outfit. And here he is in this one. So he was quite a character. I would like to go back in time and meet him. I mean, even just to name Hollis Bottomly, I mean, how cool is that? That's pretty cool. So that's what we're looking at for our really early period there. The next period that I wanted to talk about starts in 1896, and this is obviously we're talking about here. We're calling this consolidation and pre-boom development. So we're finally getting going, and we're getting some more decent buildings here. We're getting out of the palmetto shacks, and we're going to create some new things. This is an example of, this is R.W. Goods Homestead down in Melbourne. It's an example of what they started with when the people first came here, what it exactly looked like. They homesteaded on the north bank of Crane Creek in about 1877. So that's a picture of that homestead. This is the first school here. This was built in 1883 by John Goode. This was about 800 yards south of their home, and Maud Goode and May Valentine were the first teachers. It was black and white students together. There were no desks. They sat in long benches that just faced the teacher. It was painted red right from the beginning, so obviously you can't see that in this picture. But obviously very simple architecture here, right? Clapboards, and we've got our cedar shake roof and just a few simple windows there. and probably a little stove in there to keep warm. And this picture is taken about 1898. So, very simple. This is a picture of Front Street in Melbourne, which was ran along the river there about 1919. And one of the things we can point out in this, we've already got a little office on the left-hand side here for Indialantic there, promoting Indialantic already. And one thing to notice about this is every building you see here is what we consider frame vernacular. So every building here is just your clapboard structure, very simple architecture, porch. So everything you see there is frame vernacular. You've got your dirt street there. So this is how everything started in this area and then developed from here.
Michael, where would that material have come from? The boards locally?
It did. There were several sawmills. There was one on Merritt Island. There were different places. Some of it came in on the train. It just varied. Some of it was salvage. Some of the people that were near the river that were on the island, some of it was actually salvage wood from shipwrecks, things like that. So it really came from a lot of different sources. Some people cut down the timber on their own land and then sent it off to be milled. Was a thing people often did to save money as well. In this period also, you start getting something else that we're still known for today in this area, and that's the tourism industry. That started and brought a lot to this area. This is the Goode House. Later became known, as you see at the bottom, the Bellevue Apartments here. 1884, Richard Goode bought the land and built this simple building, 2-story with dormers on the top, the porch around it, and it was to house guests, obviously. So right in the earliest stages of this growth in this area revolved around tourism and people coming here. It was later purchased from the Goodes by the Campbell family, and they further enlarged it and became apartments eventually. But this is a neat example of the type of hotel architecture, which I'm going to show several now as well, with the dormers, and you get the little cupola on top there and the wide porches. Still a pretty simple structure, but getting a little more detailed. This is the Brown House that was in downtown Melbourne. And this again kind of has that same basic format and the tall roof. This is neat because it has a mansard roof, which is something you don't see in this area very often. So we're getting a little bit fancier here, right? We're putting a little more thought into it. Got the cupola up there on the top. So that's a really neat structure. And this was sort of right in the area next to where Helen Blaze's brewery is today, just to the west of that is where this was, the Brown House. Very popular for years. I've heard some scandalous things went on there too, but I guess that's what happens in the frontier days back here too. It wasn't all...
That's another lecture.
Yeah, that's another talk, yeah, right.
And disclosures.
Yeah. This is the Hotel Carlton, which was another one in the area. Again, framed vernacular. You've got the steep roof, the same little belvedere on the top, little lookout there, and the dormers. So we're seeing a little pattern here, aren't we, with some grounds there. Very common style there. So now we're getting into a little more of the residential architecture that was during that period. This is a beautiful example of what we call Queen Anne architecture, and this of course is the Strawberry Mansion, Nanny Lee's, whatever you now known as the Mansion, whatever you want to call it. And this was built in 1905 by John and Nanny Lee. And this is not only a great example of the style, but this benefited from some unique aspects. For instance, the woodwork, a lot of the interior woodwork in this home was done by Claude Bogine, who was a boat builder. And so a lot of the houses in this area did benefit from things like that, association with local people like that did some very custom things. And a lot of the things in this house show details with that. Has a great bay window that's hanging off the side there that you can see, and it's just a really great example of that. Of course, the Wells House, that everyone is probably familiar with now, and where everyone's trying to save here in Melbourne is another example of that Queen Anne architectural style. This is another more of a frame vernacular style here. This is called, that was a house called Bonaire, and it was owned by the Whiting family, 1880s and 1890s. I think they're all, everybody that lived there was piled on the porch for this picture. Probably boarders. You saw a lot of these bigger houses too, besides the hotels. They were all built to take in boarders, tourists of that time, to help with expenses. And one thing that's interesting about this house is it's one of the few ones in this area that has, we call that a Chippendale railing on the porch there, that design. And it was found almost exclusively in this area in Old Rockledge, all on the River Road, the historic houses in Rockledge. Almost every single one had this Chippendale railing for some reason. And it didn't appear in that many other places, and not very often down here. But this house did have that. So that's kind of an interesting feature there. So I don't know who all those people were, but looks like they were having a good time. You can even see the window up there, and the peak is open. Somebody was probably staying up there, and they were getting ventilation up there through that too. This is an example of one of the early styles too, and things that we see in this area. And I tried to throw some things in here that were unique to our area that you aren't going to see in every place. And this is an example of one of the boat houses that was along the O'Galley River there. So this is pretty fancy for a boathouse, don't you think? And we had several of those in our area there. You know, the Rossiters had one. Several of the old families had one. They would have parties in them and big dinners in them and hang out. They were sort of, I don't know, maybe an early man cave or she shed or something like that. Maybe it was like the early take on that. I'm thinking maybe something like that.
I think that one still exists.
I think so too, yeah. Okay, I thought so, yeah. I wasn't sure, but I was thinking it did. You've got all the shingles on the side, and dormers, quite a bit of architectural detailing in that, really, for a boat. You can even see the chimney there, so you know that was really a nice one. Even got the old coconut palms there beside it. You can kind of see there. This is the Ballard House down there, Sunny Point. This is a beautiful example of the Colonial Revival style. It was built in 1915. And this has a beautiful pergolas out front, which you can kind of see. It had beautiful grounds with this house originally. You can see the pergolas, you can see the sloped roof, the dormers, the multiple chimneys. There were big patios on the side there. So this is a really elaborate example of the Colonial Revival style. And this, of course, was built by wealthy Northerners, the Ballard family that came here, which was based their fortune off flour. And settled here really early, and brought some examples of that. So this one is, I threw this one in here because it's very unusual to find actually photos of things being constructed, really see how they were put together, not only being constructed, but see a building. As you see now, we're getting much more substantial architecture as we go up in time. This was really the first building. It was built in 1912. By W.L. Sweet, and this is, of course, Villa Marine that was over on... Yes, exactly. It is now a dentist office. Yeah. And this was the first concrete block building in the area, and the concrete block and mortar was manufactured right on the site. And you can actually see here in the foreground at the very bottom of the photo, there was a huge pit that they had dug and other pits around the building, and it was all made right there on site from the sand that was dug up. They manufactured it and just put it up right there. You can see the roof going up there with the nice overhang. So this, again, masonry vernacular, not a super fancy style, but we're getting into really good materials now, not terribly architecturally detailed, but a really unique building and a unique example for this area. This is after it was completed. You can see there, one cool thing I think is, I know it's kind of hard to see here, but there were, the posts on the porch were palmetto trunks, were palm trees that were supporting that porch. So that was a really, unique tie into our area that they obviously tried to do. And I think this is great too, because you can see the early landscaping that they actually did in this area. You got the date palm started there, canary palm, another palm in the front. You got a big clump of bamboo on the right-hand side in front of the house. So I think that's all pretty cool. This was for many years a hotel. It operated on the American plan. And while it was the best accommodation in Melbourne Beach in the area, I have heard from many people, and some of you may have heard, that it was also legendary for the stinginess of the meals at mealtime. And the small portions were endless complaints by tourists of the time about the meager food at dinner time. So I'm guessing that it wouldn't do very good on TripAdvisor today or something like that. I'm thinking it probably.
That was before Poor Richards was next door.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Sir?
Yeah. I don't think it would get many stars probably, but.
Sir? What kind of grass is that? You know?
I don't know. I don't. It's kind of hard to.
They used St. Augustine back then?
They did not. The first instance I've ever seen where they used St. Augustine, that I can prove it and it's written up, is right in the 1940s. I literally found an article from the Melbourne Times, and there was one in the Coquina Tribune that mentions the construction of a house in the 40s and said, this is the first time anyone has used rolled up St. Augustine sod on this ground, and it was in the article. So I'm thinking that didn't come till about the 40s. Yeah. This is another example of something you're only going to see here, so I wanted to throw this in. Down south here, we had a Japanese colony for quite a while, and this is the Ojai, I'm not quite sure I'm saying that exactly right, but so forgive me if I'm not, residence. And this had the Japanese style roof. In fact, there were elements on each end. It's kind of hard to see in the photo on the front, and then over the front porch there, you have all elements of the Japanese style added to this little farming cottage that they had down there. This was off of Malabar Road, I think, in that area. So that is something we're not going to see actually anywhere else in Brevard County. You're not going to see in North Brevard Central. That's going to be very specific to the architecture of this area. All right, so the next period we're going to talk about is the Florida land boom. And if ever there was a sort of glamorous time here and a real heyday of architecture, this is going to be it. So this is where you start to see some really interesting things. And we're going to start slow in this before we get to some of the really grand stuff. Really started in actually 1921 is where I have this talk starting with this house. But that's a little early for the boom. I don't usually say the boom starts till about 24. But anyway, this house is this is the Van Lengen residence, and this was on New Haven Avenue. And this is a great example of what we call the American four-square architecture. Traditionally, 4 rooms up, 4 rooms down, very square structure. Actually takes its origination from the prairie style, Frank Lloyd Wright and that whole style that started early. These are all elements that came out of that prairie style. And this is a beautiful example of that. You can see the craftsman influence on this particular house with the porch, the tapered porch columns, the dormer, there was leaded glass there was a sleeping porch on the side there. Just has all the classic elements of a four-square, really done well four-square. And this also gives you a little example of, I don't know, the area around this is either winter or something. It looks pretty beat up to me, the trees and stuff around this, but I think this is when this house was very, very new, it looks like to me. I don't think it had been standing very long when they took this photo. This is one of my favorite buildings downtown. This is the church building that was built about 1922. Doesn't quite look like that today, unfortunately. This is, funny story about this has come down throughout history, that Melbourne had several people, all the cowboys and people that lived out west of town, and often didn't come into town for a year or anything, to get once a year to get supplies. So there's an old story in town that comes down with this, that one of those guys came in to buy supplies, And this building had gone up in 1922, and he saw this building, and he informed everybody that he near broke his neck looking up at this building because it was the darn tallest thing he'd ever seen. So he was quite impressed by this building. So you can imagine its day. Brick, masonry, very high quality building here. Steel windows, limestone detailing all on the top you see with the pediments, the coins on the side, the doors. This must have been a very expensive building. It super frustrates me because I can't find out much about it, because built in 1922 in the Melbourne Times, where we get a lot of our information, didn't start until after that. So, a lot of the issues that we have are not till after that. So I cannot find anything exactly about, what it undoubtedly had an architect, a decent contractor. This is not vernacular style. This was a very high quality, would have been Italian influence actually. This could be somewhere in New York City, right? If it was next to another building. Today it unfortunately has some horrific blue detailing around the front and stucco attached to the bottom and everything. It would be great if it was freed from, but this is of course Milburn High, 1926, a shining example of the land boom and the architecture at that period of time. This is sort of traditional. It's not full-on Mediterranean revival like a lot of them that we're going to see in the land boom period. This again has a classical detailing, classic revival with the columns and the detailing, the cartouche and everything at the top. You start to see this sort of classical detailing more with public buildings like we're going to see with schools and banks. And William Christian was the architect of this. He was the architect of many of the buildings in Indialantic, was a local architect here for many years. His wife taught school here, and really well known in the community for many years. There's the old Doc Sloan house, which was, probably some of you remember, Posada del Rey, which was one of our best examples of Mediterranean revival, private residences. For those of you who weren't here back, I can tell many of you are, because I hear the exclamations, knowing that it's now gone. This is now where CVS sits at the corner of 192 and Babcock, right? On the corner there. So this beautiful building was torn down for our, same looking CVS as we have in every other town, right? This is the time period we also start getting into kit houses, right? So those are really hard to track over time, and I'm kind of the opinion that this area, and not just South Brevard, but North Brevard, Central, has a lot more kit houses than we think that we do. Problem is that they're very hard to identify, really, because there was so many common styles. Sometimes people even just had a plan book and copied from a kit home, so it's not even necessarily a kit home. But this is one that we have, and this is the example here of that. I'll go back and forth between there. This is and not all kit houses were Sears kit houses. There were really a lot of companies that did them, surprisingly enough. This is a Gordon Vantine house who was at least just as popular as Sears. In fact, most of the ones that I can identify are Gordon Vantine. Very few that I've been able to identify around here are Sears. This seems to have been the most popular company in our area, really in all of Brevard. Cocoa as well. There's several Gordon Vantines on the river in Cocoa. So that gives you an example of some of those. The influx of the railroad, the big companies like Sears that were selling these things, made it very convenient for people to build these kit homes and put them together, pick the finishes. And it's amazing the amount of detailing, sometimes even differences. There's a particular Gordon Vantine that we have in Cocoa and Rockledge, and we've got at least 4 of it. It's all the exact floor plan. It's the same house, but you really have to look at them because the owners did, one of them is stucco, one of them is block, one of them is wood. They really varied the elements, but it's all the same. It's all the same house. So you still could get a lot of variation even in a kit house. And this is on Lincoln Avenue in Melbourne, for those of you who don't know. This is the Melbourne Arcade, which was built in 1925. Obviously, very high style building there. This is more Italian Renaissance style with the Palladian windows in the front. Obviously, the high quality material with the brick and the bronze covering over the door there. Many really high style details with this. The substantial construction again that you started to see. Fireproof buildings became all the rage at that time as well during the boom. That was one of the things they advertised. You know, this building is fireproof. Sprinkler systems, the masonry construction became very important during this period. So you get some really substantial buildings. This is probably what most of us think about when we think about the Florida land boom. This is Magnolia Park. This is the very beginnings of it. And this is what the land boom started, basically most of it with big old empty stretches of land that had sat there for years, a lot of it west of town, places that hadn't been developed yet, that the lucky owners who held on to was sold for a fortune during the land boom period. And it was all divided up, and streets were stuck in, and whiteways, which is what they called, you see all the streetway lights there, they called those whiteways. Put in these palm trees that you see there, extensive landscaping, modern sewer, water went to all these houses. So these were the absolute it at that period of time, and sort of modern living and luxury were these type of developments that you see. And these were almost 100% full of the Mediterranean revival style of architecture.
Where did the sewer go? Did it go right to the river, or did they have a filtration system?
Most of them were septic. So not technically city sewer. Most of those were originally septic and were then connected later. But even that was a big deal in those days, yeah.
Is that previous house, doesn't that still exist?
Let's see which one. Yes, it does. Yep, it is. Yep. That's one of the FIT houses that's on, I think, on...
Florida Air Academy.
Yes, yeah, sorry, yeah, Florida Air Academy, yeah. Mm-hmm. It is, it's right off there, yeah. And I threw this one in because this is one of those houses also in Magnolia Park. And this is another rare photo of something that's actually under construction. And you can see here what is behind a lot of those stucco houses. This one is, they built a wood frame house, was completely covered in wood frame lath. Then they covered it in very often copper. Metal lath was attached to the wood, and then it was stuccoed. And you can also see some of the exterior garden walls, porch walls with this house were actually masonry. You can see the concrete block there, the brick chimney before it's stuccoed. But it just gives you a really rare example of the kind of construction that went into these houses. And it ranged drastically in the boom because people were building these houses fast as they could. You know, they were selling like hotcakes, as they say. So I've seen, this kind of construction, and I've seen 2x4s with wood spaced this far apart that they just attach metal to. So, it depends on the builder and how much the person wanted to spend and how fast they were trying to do it. Labor was very expensive in those days. Equally like it is today, I think, is probably about the same as today. This is that house when it was nearing being finished, so that gives you an idea of what it looks like there. They're putting the finishing touches here. You can see to the stucco and the roof on the side there that they're working on. So you can see how that kind of ends up looking, but that's often what's underneath there. So still a huge amount of craftsmanship, right? I mean, these were all built by hand. All this stuff, all these lath, all that lath on that. Can you imagine? All those pieces of lath had to be nailed onto that frame, and they did the same on the inside. The inside plaster in these houses is all what the lath and plaster, and all of that is nailed on. I mean, it's just incredible the amount of, even in this period of time where you think maybe it wasn't the quote craftsmanship of, say, 1890s, it really was an immense amount of work and materials that went into one of these houses.
Central Avenue, wasn't it?
I think so. Yeah. This is one of course, the Florida Air Academy. This was the big house that was there, the Cowanhoven House, that later became a hotel, but obviously was the premier example of the Mediterranean Revival style in a private residence in all of South Brevard, probably all of Brevard, except for maybe Hacienda del Sol on Merritt Island. So that's just an amazing example of that. Later became the Lincoln Hotel, and of course is still standing today in a little bit of an altered state. This is the Women's Club that was where Trinity Towers is today. Again, a great example of Mediterranean Revival, but a little bit different style here. You see much more square lines, a little bit of more of the territorial style here, and you see the fabulous windows on the right-hand side here that lit up the big meeting room. That is really a unique feature of that property. You can see above the door it had in Women's Club carved into the stone up there. And of course here we have Indialantic, which was the Hotel Indialantic. This would have been undoubtedly in the whole county, this would have been the premier example of the Mediterranean Revival style in a public building versus the Cowanhoven House. So this was begun construction in 1924, did not finish till 1926 when it had its grand opening. This was all masonry, was terracotta tile, was block. The floors were Vermont slate that was brought in by train and caused quite a sensation in Melbourne when it pulled in that day with tons and tons of slate, and was then sent out over to the hotel. That was written up extensively in the paper, and was everything in this hotel was the best possible construction, the best possible materials, from the roof to the windows. They literally, as you would say, spared no expense building this building. Unfortunately, perhaps took a little too long to build it and spend a little too much money. It really, in 1926, really the land boom was over. The boom was really barely hanging on in 1926, and so for years this hotel is a lot of you know, went through many different transitions, was a hotel, used for various things over the years, and of course unfortunately was torn down and was not in need to be torn down, even though that was kind of batted around at the time. They could barely get the thing down, for those of you who remember the steel and all the concrete and everything that was in it. I can't remember. Does anybody remember when the trade winds exactly came down? Was it 80s? 85? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, probably. It's about right then. This is the Indialantic Casino, which was built in 1923 in the Mediterranean Revival style, also by the same architect, William Christian. And this had shops and an Olympic-sized saltwater pool and diving platform, and was really the toast of the town for many, many years. Was just a center of action. Beauty contests, beautiful baby contests were held there. In World War II, the flight soldiers that were here trained and swam and did scuba diving and stuff in the pool for their flight training and things like that. So for many years was an important part of the community. And this also came down in 1970, was torn down.
What is the structure to the right on that one?
That's the diving platform.
Wow.
Yeah, the tower there, the dome structure. That's the diving platform. It had several different levels, actually. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't know how deep that pool must have been, but it must have been a really deep pool for that diving platform. Yeah. This is the ice plant, of course, in Melbourne. This was another one that began construction in 1926. This is one of our rare examples of modernistic architecture, maybe our only really good example that we have in the area of modernistic architecture. The plans for this in 1926 called for it to cost $30,000. It took much longer and went way over budget and ended up costing $100,000. And it actually was the last ice plant that FPL built in the whole area. They built several over the years. It might have been the straw that sort of broke the camel's back. And of course the boom was over and that all along with it. This has a steel frame. It's tile block construction and stucco, and was one of the best examples of the modern construction and that modernistic style. And we are very lucky to think that this one has survived for sure. This is the State Bank of O'Galley. This is what we call the neoclassical style, which we also don't have a lot of examples around here. Named for its the symmetry of the style. You see the big columns in front there, the brick. This was built again at the height of the land boom, and this style neoclassical, just like the school, you also saw on the Melbourne Bank. You see the bank in Cocoa. Almost every bank was built in this style at that period of time, and we just kind of assume it's because this style seems to kind of just exudes confidence, doesn't it? Like solidity, and we're strong, and we're solvent. Put your money here, which we all know is a big mistake. In fact, this bank, the cashier ran off in the middle of the night with a bunch of the money, never to be heard from again. So that didn't turn out very well. The bank in Cocoa was the same. The guy did the same thing, except he went to jail for it. They caught him, and he served 7 years on the chain gang for taking the money for the Cocoa Bank.
There's the Flatiron.
This original fountain in front of it there. There was a park there from very early days. And the Flatiron, for those of you who don't know, actually refers to the layout of the building, which resembles, being that unique size, resembles a flat iron, the unique lot that they have there. Of course, Flatiron Building in New York. This is probably the most impressive of Melbourne's commercial buildings. 3 stories, again, masonry, Mediterranean revival style with the parapet roof, the Palladian window on the top, the finials on the corner, cartouche, it's hard to see from that. But spectacular example of that. It was built in January of 1925, and this building cost $50,000 and was designed by Kibbe and Clark. So it's always had offices, always been a part of Melbourne, and always been in use there. That was the latest thing. I had to throw this one in since we were here today. This is the original Melbourne Library. And I also think it's super cool was built during the boom as well. I think it's super cool just for an architectural, because it's such a total mismatch of everything. You have what essentially looks like a craftsman building. You have craftsman style windows. You've got the deep overhang. You've got little craftsman brackets on the side, the tapered columns on the front. But then it's covered in stucco, because we're in the land boom, so it's got to be a little bit Spanishy. And you've got the windows kind of awkwardly up high, but undoubtedly, I'm thinking that's because the bookshelves were all underneath, right? So that's why those were up so high to let the light in. But just a super cool, functional little building, I think. Thought I had to throw that one in there. Yeah, I think it was just all the way open to the ceiling, and let the light in there.
Where was it?
Right here.
Yeah, right in this still general vicinity here. Yep. All right. So now our final period that I'm going to talk about is the Great Depression, and we probably think, well, probably wasn't much going on, right? But it's interesting. You find in a lot of places that if people were able to hold on to their money, they built some really cool stuff in the Depression. And we have some great examples here in this area. This is one that I had to throw into. It's not here anymore, unfortunately. Again, I'm sorry. This is the Davidson house, C.L. Davidson. They called him Locke. This was on Malabar Road, and it burned in the late 1960s. It was built in 1927, so in the Depression, and it was brand new in April 12th, 1927. We found an article about it. It had electricity. It had built-in radio. This was a very, very fancy log cabin. And I think what's great about it is you've got a garage over here, even on the side. And you've got some really unique Florida elements. It's a little bit hard to see, but on the front porch there, those are cypress knees that are cut, and you kind of see that design in the front there on the different balconies. So it's just a really unique example. Don't know why they chose to build that there or what went on with that style, but was very creative, I think. That is a rare photo of the inside of it from the 30s. Again, you can see a bunch of cypress knees underneath the open railing. It was like a big lodge inside, coquina fireplace. Again, some cypress knees on top of the mantel. Some spinning wheels down front just for authenticity, I guess. And a giant alligator skin stretched out over the top there. So looks like somebody went on safari or something, and all this stuff. And then mixed with grandma's curtains up there. I don't know. It's kind of a unique style. But this caught fire in the 60s and burned, as you can imagine, in a matter of minutes with this old pine or cypress logs that it was made out of. This, of course, is the William Horne house, which was built in 1934. And this, again, is a beautiful example of the neoclassical style, one of the few that we have in residential architecture. Same style as the O'Galley State Bank that we just talked about. Very similar materials with the brick. And you have the... What's great about this house, too, is it's really still very original. Everything you see there is basically what was there. You've got the shutters, the porte-cochere on the right-hand side, all of the detailing that this shows. And this was the Hornes owned a chain of grocery stores, so, you know, people still had to eat, even in the Depression, right? So there was still some money going there. Has the full height porch. This, of course, is right on the looks out at the O'Galley River there, right across from Ballard Park on the other side, and it's right on the water there. Beautiful spot.
Across from the yacht
Yes,
house?
yep, right there.
Yeah.
Beautiful home. This is another style that you do not see very often, and this is what they call the Monterey Colonial style. This was built in May of 1937, and it was the E.C. Lathrop House. Cost $7,500 to build. Was a 7-room house. It's an L-shaped plan, wood frame on the second floor, and brick on the first floor. And the Monterey style was one you don't see, there's very few examples in this area, and was one very popular in California. It never quite caught on as much in Florida, although you do see quite a few of them in Palm Beach and West Palm Beach. But this is one of the very few examples we have here, and it's a fusion of styles. The Monterey, it depends on when it was built. The ones that were built towards the end of the land boom are usually more Spanish, often have stucco. The balconies are very Spanish looking, and that's really what this plays off of. It was a mismatch of that New England traditional architecture and kind of the Spanish that you saw in the South, and that's how it was kind of put together. And this one is a little bit later period, so I think this one resembles a little bit more New England style than the early period that were a lot more Spanish. This is still there today on the corner there, and is an office building. The shutters are painted a kind of a wild color. And this is our last slide of the day. Got you all are still awake. This is one of the few examples that we have of the international style. And this is the W.G. Tubbs house that's on Alger Smith Lane. It unfortunately is I saw it the other day, is in very, very terrible shape. I think it's abandoned. And this is a style that we don't have a lot of here, but it was one of the most popular styles in the United States for commercial buildings. Between 1930 and the mid-70s, this international style was literally the most popular style in the entire nation. The international style, it grew out of the whole Bauhaus in Germany, the whole French School of Beaux Arts. It was a whole thing that derived after the war, particularly, that they came, and it was very utilitarian. It shunned any sort of ornamentation, smooth surfaces, rows of glass block, very often a flat roof. All of those things were very, very strong elements of this style, and so it could be done for not inexpensive price. This is on Alger Smith Lane, which is right off of US 1, right by the car dealership there. Trying to remember which. Yeah, just south of Sarno. Yeah, it's really hidden all in the bushes. You might want to go back and drive by one day and check it out. But that's our one example of that. These houses didn't tend to hold up very well because the flat roofs, the no overhangs, you got water intrusion, you got those kind of things. So it's something that didn't end up being the best idea for Florida. This is also what kind of grew into the Art Deco style as a whole result of that you see a lot of course, in South Beach and other places. So that's just sort of one of our local examples there. And that takes us right about to 1940, which is the end of our coverage period for this talk. We could get into a whole nother thing on mid-century. We got all the fabulous things we've got after that, but that's a whole nother thing. So that's where I'm going to leave you today, and I hope you guys can drive around and maybe spot some of these buildings and find some of these elements and some other ones that I probably haven't spotted, and give you kind of a new appreciation for the great area where we live maybe and what's come before. And if anybody has any questions before we end, you can ask now or come up after or whatever you like. Anybody have any questions?
Where you're up in Cocoa, there's a lot of the mini Palm Beach homes. Is that what they call them, or like on Orange Avenue or along Rockledge Drive?
Right. Probably the Mediterranean revival style too, the Spanish style.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You don't see that too much down here, or is there a cluster of those?
Like the Magnolia Park area that's around the Air Academy, the neighborhood, the Bluffs, which is the Bluff neighborhood, which is up here. It's all the number, like AB is the AB Street. It's all those that are up off here. That's another area. They tended to be those tended to be all in developments because those were land due, just like you're talking about in Orange and Rockledge. That was a Valencia development. Those were all developments. They didn't tend to infill as much with those houses. Other places, they were kind of all planned at one time and were part of a community. So, and of course, Indialantic, almost everything in Indialantic when it started was that style.
I just have a curious question. I don't know if you know the answer, but why did the building boom stop before the Depression started?
Good question, yeah. The answer to that is a couple of different things. Florida was under a microscope, so to speak. It took a real beating in the press. People just... People were coming to Florida just in droves. For years and years, 24, 25, 26, they were leaving New York, they were leaving all these other places, they were selling places, they were making tons of money here. And one of the things that started early was, even in New York Times in particular, they just got nasty. They got so jealous over the success of Florida and what was going on. You started to see these editorials, just random in papers all over the country about what was going on in Florida and what the heck was going on there. Why was everybody going there? And certainly this can't be sustained and yada yada. And so people started thinking twice about it. And then what ended up, I think, was the the final nail in the coffin was the huge hurricane of 1926 came in, and it didn't affect this area as much, but it came in through Miami, wiped out Miami Beach, took out hotels, destroyed golf courses, according to the press, thousands killed, the dikes at Okeechobee overflowed, people drowned. So the press took that up that was exactly what they were waiting for, if they were. And, they just beat that all over the place. And it really just killed it. And it also was not sustainable because the land boom, people were buying a lot in the morning for $400 and taking a deposit on it, selling it at 2 o'clock for $600, selling it the next day for $800. All the while they were taking just small. No one was paying cash. It was all on credit, or they were putting a down payment down. So it was all just built on this prosperity that was in the air. So then when people just decided, look, there's nothing to this anymore, they all just walked away, and it just came crashing down. And people that had properties couldn't sell them. People left for back taxes. That's actually when my family came to the area. Actually, my family were down in West Palm. My great-grandfather was a builder and an architect, and that's what he came down and started doing was the Spanish and the Mediterranean revival. And they built a house for themselves down there in West Palm that's today in a very, still very fancy area. And they walked away from that house in 1927. They walked out the door and they let it go. They still had kept their house up north, and they came back and forth, and they just literally let it go for back taxes, which is what just a lot of people did. So yes, this area in Florida in particular was much worse off much sooner than the rest of the country was because of that land boom collapse.
Michael, we'll just take one more question. Sure. There was a lady back here that had her hand up. No, do you want any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Between the Catholic Church and Fee Avenue Park, there are some of those Mediterranean revivals. Were they part of a community?
I don't know. I honestly don't know about. Yeah. I'm guessing probably not. The smaller ones that were like that were in those neighborhoods were probably just ones that people were building, just for that style of run. There were a lot of spec homes at that time too. People were building just like they do today, spec homes and throwing them up. Mm-hmm.
Let's give Michael a big hand.
All right, thank you guys.
Actually looking forward for his next slide presentation for the years after.
Uh-oh, boy.
We just want
nothing happened after 1940.
We just want you to know that we actually have a series of discussions or historical events like this every month. And next month we have about Florida forts here in Florida, and that's going to be presented by Zacharias. He's from the Museum of Arts and Science in Daytona, and that is on May 11th. Then on June 8th, which I'm really looking forward to this one, we're going to have two presentations by Beth Glover and Sally Stewart. They grew up here in Melbourne, and they're going to be talking about old days here in Melbourne and growing up in this area, and they are both wonderful women. If you ever met them, that's going to be a lively discussion. So I encourage you to also put those down on your calendar. By the way, if you would like to join the South Brevard Historical Society, it's only $10 a year. What a deal! And you can sign up as you're leaving back here, and we send out emails, and we would love to have you as a member here and to participate in just not these discussions, but other things that South Brevard Historical Society is doing. We're here to help preserve the history of the South Brevard, and we have lots of little things going on that you aren't even aware of. But we're so happy to have you here. Also, if you ever like to make a donation, we have a jar back there. You're welcome to leave a donation also for the Historical Society. Thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next month.